What if, instead of the left of the USA protesting a Vietnam-style proxy war in the Cold War, it was the far right? In this alternate timeline, inspired by Kaiserreich, the socialist Americans are performing a total invasion of the Brazilian Empire. Their goal? Crush the far-right integralists, support socialist uprisings across Africa, and spread the revolution across the Western Hemisphere, a socialist reincarnation of the Monroe Doctrine. As the American liberators make landfall into northern Brazil, their advance would be halted by relentless warriors who would use their terrain to their advantage, bogging down the Americans in a guerrilla war, much like the Vietnam War of our history. The exiled Pope in Rio de Janeiro has called all faithful Catholics from without and within America to resist their invasion attempts, emboldening the Brazilian soldiers and inspiring radical Catholics within America to perform peaceful, but eventually violent protests. In this video, I will explore what I believe a syndicalist America would look like, why it would invade Brazil, and show how this one war could be the decider in this alternate Cold War. This could be a little hard to follow if you haven't watched my first and second episodes of my Krasnacht series. I would recommend you check them out if you want to get a little more understanding of the rest of the world, but you don't need to. Thanks for your consideration. Let's get into it. Let's start off with a quick rundown, explaining the differences between capitalism, socialism, and how it's important to define a socialist America. The basic difference between capitalism and socialism comes down to who owns the means of production. In capitalism, the private sector owns it. You can hold a chunk of a factory, never step foot inside, but still collect dividends. In socialism, the public owns it. No one person controls the factory. It belongs to the collective. The problem lies in trying to define what the collective is. In the Soviet Union, the revolution started in a mostly feudal society. Marxist intellectuals built socialism through a vanguard party. They claimed to represent the people, but in practice, they managed everything top-down. Over time, the Communist Party itself became a new ruling class, decadent, detached, and eventually brittle enough to collapse. Now compare that to what Marx had initially anticipated. He thought socialism would begin in an already industrialized country like Britain or France. The idea was pretty simple. Factory workers would overthrow their bosses, run production for themselves, and spread that model across the world. Eventually, the state would wither away as communism would be achieved. On paper, both the Soviet model and Marx's prediction look pretty similar. The public owns the means of production, and society is structured around that. But in practice, they're very different blueprints. To put it simply, Soviet socialism was top-down, with the party directing the workers. Marx's vision is bottom-up, where the workers direct the party. And this is the difference between Leninism and Syndicalism. So when you're designing a syndicalist America, you would want it to be the way that Marx had visualized. But the difficulty comes when you realize there's been no syndicalist republic that has ever existed in real life beyond the revolutionary phase, never being able to implement their policy in peacetime. But that's also why Kaiserreich syndicalism is so appealing. It's the ultimate socialist what if. What if Marx's vision actually had came true? What if socialism took root in industrial societies led by unions instead of a party? It's a neat way to imagine a world where Lenin's mistakes get sidestepped entirely. But without the historical precedent to guide us towards what a syndicalist America would look like, we are left to make parallels with the Soviet Union, like how the original Krasnacht had attempted to depict the political structure of the Commonwealth of America. Despite syndicalism's character of enabling several different regional representations through local unions, all the parties that each union may be associated with all syndicate themselves into the Socialist Party of America. Not only that, but besides the fact that this chart specifies that there are regional parties that can gain seats in the People's Assembly, the leader of the country, the president, can only be an SPA member. So while there was a genuine attempt to compromise between the syndicalist political model and American political tradition, it ultimately ended up resembling the Soviet model, with only minor concessions. The solution to this is very easy. Just drop the attempts to depict America as a syndicalist or workers' republic, and have them be a USSR analog. Twilight Struggle does this, and the development of their version of the Union is very straightforward. But in my version of Krasnacht, I won't be doing this. Instead, I will be taking inspiration from the first American Civil War's Reconstruction period in order to find the perfect blend between the old and new America. A house divided cannot stand. Abraham Lincoln may have led the USA during the Civil War, which put the very foundations of America at risk. But despite the treason of the South and their battle against the federal government, Lincoln had advocated for only 10% of the population of these occupied states to swear fealty to the Union before the state could be reintegrated. This had gone against the desires of those who'd sought radical Reconstruction, but Lincoln feared that pushing too hard would only invite a second, more powerful revolt. His successors compromised even further, and the result was disastrous. Segregation, Jim Crow, and decades of struggle until the Civil Rights era. Now let's fast forward. Imagine a socialist victory in the Second American Civil War. The government in Chicago would face the exact same dilemma. Do you attempt a radical reconstruction of America, abolishing the old institutions completely, or do you compromise to prevent a permanent civil war? While the Constitution, as detailed in Kaiserreich's flavor events, guarantees the freedoms that America had in the past, I believe that these rights could not be applied evenly. While the core regions of the industrial heartland of the Syndicalists would be enthusiastic of this new political reality, a large portion of people in the South and other reactionary regions would be actively antagonistic. In our history, while the southern states were under military occupation, the constitutional rights guaranteed to all Americans would be restricted. Just like our history, this would need to have happened here, especially as such a radical societal shift away from capitalism would necessitate the confiscation of land of the former ruling class and elevate local unions to political relevance. So either these regions remain excluded, fueling an endless guerrilla war, or they are brought back in only under tight restrictions that hollow out the very liberties the Constitution claims to uphold. This is why Abraham Lincoln had advocated for only 10% loyalty. If America was ever to reunify, it would mean needing to accept some old institutions and cultural traditions in order to destroy slavery. The question is, would compromise with these dissidents betray the ideological principles of syndicalism? In the early 20th century, syndicates that compromised with capital or tolerated class collaboration were branded yellow syndicalists. Critics would draw parallels to the logic of fascism, a corporatist system where the state binds all classes, upper and lower, together instead of empowering the workers directly. That danger is very real. A syndicalist America that makes too many concessions risks sliding into corporatism, where the revolutionary spirit is replaced by a state-managed compromise between classes. But a syndicalist America that refuses concessions risks becoming a paper republic that must silence dissent and rule by force in half of the country. Either path threatens to destroy the project. This is why I argue that if syndicalism were ever to survive in America, it couldn't look like the Soviet Union, and it would definitely not be as utopian as Kaiserreich depicts. It would have to be something uniquely American, a system that dismantles landlordism, but still preserves the cultural pillars of old America. Otherwise, socialism in America would be crushed, not by foreign invaders, but its own people. Therefore, America would allow for many reactionary strongholds to be reintegrated, despite the threat of their subversion, with reforms that would eventually deviate the American syndicalist model to be distinct from the rest of the international forces. Or in other words, syndicalism with American characteristics. However, this would only last for so long, as given enough time, reactionary elements within the Republic would be able to adopt syndicalist policies. These local unions could eventually band together, and they would have the perfect opportunity to, at the outbreak of the Brazil War. The American syndicalists would face their ideological opposite in Brazil. While the Americans are liberal syndicalists, the Brazilians are an integralist reactionary monarchy. Supported by the Pope in exile, the Brazilians would be directly involved with the continued existence of the Portuguese colonial possessions in Africa as they seek to integrate the Portuguese into their empire. An opportunity to prevent Brazil's expansion would come as a wave of anti-imperial unrest would sweep through southern and central Africa. As the Americans begin supplying these revolts with weaponry, they would clash with Brazilian naval shipping routes to these colonial states. This conflict of interest would result in a naval engagement between the two powers, escalating this proxy conflict to become a direct one. Following this incident, the Americans would plan their liberation of the proletariat by occupying northern Brazil. This strategy is inspired by our timeline's War Plan Rubber, where the USA had plans to occupy northern Brazil in the event of an alignment with the Axis, in order to prevent the Atlantic Ocean from falling into Axis control. But American ambitions would not be limited to just securing the Atlantic. The gauntlet has been thrown, and America will ensure that Syndicalism would be spread to the rest of the Americas in a new form of the Monroe Doctrine. This war should be a walk in the park for America. However, I believe that this may be our timeline's Vietnam War, where difficult terrain, including other logistical issues, will make this war much more complicated. But why would it only be America fighting the Brazilians? Wouldn't the Americans have the support of the international forces? While there would definitely be in-force support for the Brazilian People's Republic, the American adaptation of Orthodox Syndicalism would lead to a Euro-American split. This setup allows for the INFOR and SAR Pact to influence America and Brazil both. With the INFOR giving America more support, the popularity of Orthodox Syndicalism could increase, and the SAR Pact could find ways to shift the public's opinion away from integralist monarchism and towards a national revivalist republic, allowing both to expand on their faction regardless of the outcome. The ways that this war could resolve are very interesting. Since this would likely be the last proxy conflict and the most likely to trigger a third Weltkrieg, there are a lot of different paths that this could go, depending on how successful the Americans and Brazilians are in their own domestic situations and previous foreign conflicts. This could be represented by national spirits or internal stability modifiers, but could also be purely represented gameplay mechanics-wise, as the Integralist National French could send volunteers, the formerly Portuguese colonies could provide resources, and other neighboring states would either be neutral or direct Brazilian allies, while the Americans may gain direct military allies through the revolution supported ahead of time in the Southern Cone. With the integralist Brazilians defeating the Argentinian and Chilean socialist republics, they would be reorganized into permanent allies of Brazil, but would also be forced to revive the Arancinian kingdom. Despite their defeat, it's very likely that they would have another socialist revolution. This could have been something that the American player could have done ahead of time in order to prepare for this Brazilian conflict. But even if they had laid the groundwork for these revolutions, the direct support of them would be difficult for two reasons. The first reason would be that their naval capabilities would be limited by the lack of control over the Panama Canal. While a demand of allowing passage may be accepted, it would be far more dramatic for Panama to always refuse and join in the defense of Brazil. But even without the canal access, the Pacific Fleet would be able to make a connection. However, this is where the Federalist remnants would need to make their stand. Awaiting an opportunity to reclaim their homeland for a decade, the Navy of the Federalists would engage the Syndicalists. While the federal government would have been simply pawns of the Russians, it would not stop the vengeful exiles from at least attempting to halt the unstoppable march of the revolution. While the Americans may be able to tactfully capitulate the Brazilian Empire with a couple of well-timed naval invasions, the only way for the Brazilian Empire to win the conflict is if the American home front falls before the Brazilians do. While I spent a lot of time detailing the problems with the American political scenario, that's not to say that they wouldn't be stable. For the first years of gameplay, things would be relatively stable, but after the Pope calls for all faithful to resist the American incursion, American society would definitely fracture. While Kaiserreich depicts that many Catholics would end up being supporters of the regime, adopting Christian socialist outlooks, I believe that the Pope's announcement may trigger domestic security to investigate and target Catholics all throughout America. While there may be some actual sleeper cells within these churches, the paranoia that the socialists have towards the Catholics would cause all Catholics within America to fear their intentions. This societal weak point could be exacerbated with foreign intelligence agencies encouraging the societal divide. While the societal divide is deepening, the fragmented reactionary parties within America would announce a congress, wherein they would form the Freedom Party. While many would accuse the Freedom Party of holding crypto-Savankovites alongside crypto-liberals within their ranks, they would tactfully evade such accusations by professing their adoration of the syndicalist system. But how could any sort of organization exist like this in America? As I mentioned earlier, yellow syndicalism was a term designated for workers' syndicates who, instead of adhering to Marxist principles of a working class-led society, had made compromises with their factory owners. This practice is referred to by leftists as class collaboration, which is antithetical of the Marxist principle of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But while these revisions of syndicalism are despised by orthodox syndicalists, they would have the freedoms to organize and express their freedom of speech to criticize the government for its actions against the Catholics of America and the war effort against Brazil. While fascist adjacent, I believe that most fascists would have been purged due to the revolution and a McCarthy-era style purge of national revivalists. Therefore, the leadership of the party could fall to a moderate conservative Catholic like James A. Farley or Alfred E. Smith. But despite their moderate forerunner, there would definitely be opportunities for IRL fascists. In this timeline, Mussolini totalists like Lawrence Dennis would join this party, as well as any totalist party members who fall more in the National Syndicalist wing than the Stalinist wing. As the societal divide between Catholics and the amount of unions swaying their membership to join the Freedom Party increases, internal fighting within unions could lower production efficiency, as the Freedom Party's lack of Marxist principles lead moderates and radicals to ostracize each other from their factories. In some cases, I believe some unions would actually elect to go on strike in protest of the government's actions in Brazil. While the most obvious impact gameplay-wise would be the reduction in military factory efficiency, I think that the most damaging and plausible strikes to occur would be in the Texan oil fields. The historically conservative state would lend to increased Freedom Party membership, and therefore, strikes. With the oil that Texas holds being vital to the American war effort no longer flowing into the military's hands, it raises the question, why would this situation ever be allowed to occur in the first place? In Soviet history, workers had no real legal right to strike. While strikes were not explicitly outlawed in theory, a worker's loyalty to the collective was effectively measured by their ongoing participation in state labor, and challenging this through strike action would result in a punishment. Many modern leftists have criticized the Soviet Union for this policy, which is why syndicalism as a political ideology is such an appealing alternative. If the unions are in the government, then how could there ever be any conflict within the working class? Well, due to our American syndicalism not being purely devoted to Marx, we have situations where a separate party of syndicates is effectively organized to resist the Marxist reforms that the orthodox syndicalists were hoping to gradually implement. And as long as this Brazil war remains unresolved, the home front would continuously destabilize. As long as these strikes continue, especially in the case of the oil strikes, the presumed right to strike could be proven a false one once federal troops are sent to break the strikes. This decision to arrest a union for striking would radicalize the Freedom Party, and could even be the catalyst for another civil war, where orthodox syndicalists revise the Constitution to either unify America into a one-party state, or restrict the freedoms associated with the American constitutions of the past, to ensure that a political deadlock like this does not occur again. If the Americans end up engulfed in a civil war while invading the Brazilians, it may be that the syndicalists perform a white peace with Brazil, withdrawing their support for the socialists there, or refuse to surrender, and ultimately capitulate to the Freedom Front's revolution. Either way, the American home front collapsing is Brazil's only win condition. The Freedom Party, especially as the radicalism of the movement grows, would become a larger and larger tent of crypto-liberals and longists alike, who, once the revolution begins, would see no need to hide their beliefs anymore. But the political debates that would have engulfed the Freedom Party since its conception would lead to a dominant faction of people who would seriously want to adopt the non-Marxist, yet syndicalist model that the party had strived for. A truly fascist corporatist state could rise in America if given the chance. I honestly tried, you guys. I made another fascist America, okay? I'm sorry. It's just so easy. This can mean a direct alignment with Savinkov's Russia, but I find it far more likely that this America would lead a non-aligned movement, or perhaps a detente with the Russians. I think that the only other plausible one would be a federalist coup, where the Freedom Party is sidelined and the federal government is restored following an elimination of the syndicalist Americans. In this case, they would be directly Sarpak aligned, seeing as the Russians had been ideologically swaying the federal government to radicalism. The most likely out of these events is that the American syndicalists go full orthodoxy, join the Infor, gain enough European support to destroy the Freedom Party, and become a stalwart ally of the Europeans, leading into the next decade of conflict. But the most appealing outcome to me is a mix of all these elements together. A Pacific coast dominated by federal government exiles, and a rump Social Credit Party Canada, based in British Columbia, aligned with the Sarpak, and a socialist American state aligned with the Infor. A delicate situation such as this could lead to a third world war. It would be the ultimate cherry on top for a Russia player, as they would now need to manage a Pacific theater that would include America, on top of China if they haven't already neutralized the threat. But that's enough talk about how the American syndicalists could fall. Let's talk about other pro-American outcomes. So if the Americans are able to continue the war effort despite the troubles at home, several different outcomes may manifest. If the Americans are able to capitulate the Brazilians through strategic naval invasions and more, the Americans would be able to enforce a syndicalist republic in the area. The Americans would, depending on how their internal politics resolve, either decide to create their own American-based socialist faction as a non-aligned movement, or fully join the Infor, poised to turn their weapons towards the Russians as revenge for their covert and overt resistance to the revolution. But a very funny outcome could occur where, if the monarchy is deposed either by democratic Republicans or a Savinkovite takeover of the Integralist Party, a conditional surrender to the Americans could take place, where the imperial acquisitions are reversed, demilitarization is enforced, and neutrality is demanded in order to prevent the Brazil War from triggering a third Weltkrieg. The reason why this would be so funny is that if the national revivalist Republicans, who are overtly Sarpak aligned, manage the white peace of the Syndicalist Americans, they would justify this peace to their populace as a successful deposition of the monarchy, even if the result is far worse. In true American fashion, eh? There's also the possibility that the American player elects to use nuclear weapons on the Brazilians. I think that if they do, the Freedom Party would immediately revolt, the Brazilians would immediately join the Sarpak, and the Europeans would join the Americans. Long story short, third Weltkrieg. Well, this is my take on Krasnacht.
Well, my videos have just been ideas on how I can make a Krasnacht successor. There are 2 that exist right now. If you want to join their projects, go ahead. If you want to take this idea that I've made, you can take it and make it yourself. Just be sure to work together.
Anyway, it's been your Lord Dad. Thank you to my channel members for your support. Look both ways when you cross the street, and I hope you have a good day.